Hello and welcome to another round of the OAuth Happy Hour. I'm Aaron Parecki, and we've got Micah Silverman here as well, again as usual. Good to see everybody here. If you are watching us live, then feel free to drop in questions in the chat at any point, and we are here to just talk about OAuth, talk about security, web security, talk about whatever you want, answering questions. So thank you for joining, and we'll share some updates about what's been going on in the OAuth world as well, because we're in the middle of a whole series of meetings right now, of interim meetings for the OAuth group, and there's some interesting new stuff coming down the pipe. So I guess let's just jump right in.
Yeah, it's good to be back again.
Yeah, absolutely. The last meeting of the OAuth group was on Monday. We've been doing these weekly meetings. These are the official, on the record, working group meetings where there's an agenda and minutes and all that. And each week we've been focusing on a new topic, a different topic. And this week the topic was about a new document that is not necessarily a new spec. It's kind of an interesting new development in the space. So we've got here's the oh geez, that was the wrong button. Let me try that again. I was trying to share my screen. It is, what is going on? It is because that. There we go. This is the document. We've got the identity use cases in browser catalog. That was the official name of this draft. You may notice, however, if you read it, that there's actually not much there. Basically, this document is meant to collect use cases that the community has for how identity is used in browsers. So, for example, this is one scenario written up. This is the only one in the document, but this is meant to collect all of them. So this isn't even like fully fleshed out, but the idea is that we use, one example of the way that identity works in browsers is the OpenID Connect redirect-based sign-in flow via a form post. And this talks about roughly how the flow works. It's not meant to be the canonical description of how the flow works, but just enough to kind of describe it to people in general. How is it supposed to work? What are privacy considerations? What else do we care about that flow? And the reason for doing this is because browsers are on a mission to change a lot of things about how they work. In particular, around how tracking, how ad tracking and things like that work. So this was all kind of motivated because the advertising on the web has gotten kind of out of control, and there's a lot of tracking going on. And just yesterday, I was looking at like a local news web page because like a friend had shared a link to a video that he was in on the local news. The page loaded 30 megabytes of random crap from hundreds of different domains, all to show me a 2-minute video. And that is a little bit out of control. And now I have no idea what kind of ads I'm going to get forever now because of the particular website I went to. But, they're trying to track me and track all the browsers to profile users and figure out how to serve targeted ads. So, the ad networks.
As a side note, I think that I know you've had experience with this. I have too. I often will go and find direct links to video for things like conferences or just videos that I want to watch and send that to my friends rather than the landing page, because then you just get the video feed
Right.
and not the 8,000 other things the page is trying to load. Just
Right.
as a side note. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's pretty bad, and the ad networks are trying to make money and track people, whatever. They have their motivations, and then the browsers are trying to sort of. I don't want to give them so much credit that they're trying to protect users, but they're trying to at least do something to help the user experience, let's say. Um, and one of the things that's being done is the idea of classifying websites to mark them as being part of ad networks. Of like, this website uses ads. How do you determine that if the browser wants to decide this website has ads on it? How is it going to do that? Well, it's going to look for things like, is it behaving like a website that is tracking users? And once you can classify a website as doing that, then you can do other things like showing different icons up in the header saying this website is profiling you or is tracking you, kind of like how we have the secure lock icon for SSL. So those are the kinds of things that you could do once you could know if a website is part of an ad network or is an ad tracker. So how are you going to determine if one is? Well, websites aren't gonna tell you that. They're not going to opt in to just voluntarily say, yes, we are tracking you. So the browsers are going to be doing profiling of websites to say, is this behaving like a tracker? And how do ad trackers work? Well, a lot of them work by embedding URLs from other domains and then sharing cookies around, right? So a lot of that stuff we're seeing now being removed from the browsers. The whole third-party cookie issue that is going to be breaking, or actually already has broken, a lot of single sign-on flows. So that's one example of browsers changing to adapt to that behavior. But there's this new thing happening, which is the classifying websites based on if they are doing many redirects. So you can imagine, like, if you wanted to bounce somebody through a bunch of domains to set cookies on all the domains to be able to link them later, you would do a bunch of redirect chains, right? You could bounce them through 10 different redirects. Each domain would set its own first-party cookie, so you're not doing any third-party cookies here, and that works fine. So that redirect chain is a behavior of ad networks. And that's now going to be a signal that a website is an ad tracker, which then has other implications that aren't necessarily defined yet. So that's fine, but how does single sign-on work? Well, it also uses redirect chains, right? You redirect from the app over to the OpenID Connect server and then back to the app. And that's if you only have a bare minimum implementation of OpenID Connect, right? In practice, it's more likely that you have a few different hops once you hit the OpenID Connect server. Like if you've delegated to another IDP from there, now you've got redirect from the app to your OIDC server, and then redirect to the actual identity provider, which then might also redirect elsewhere and come back eventually, right? So the more redirects in that chain, the more it looks like an ad network. So the big concern here is everybody's OpenID Connect flows suddenly getting flagged as ad trackers, which then might, again, we don't necessarily know what the browsers are going to be doing once it is classified as that. It could be prompting the user, like put up a big dialogue saying, hey, do you want to let this website continue doing this thing that it seems to be doing? Or it could be an insecure icon in the corner somewhere. We don't really know yet. That's all TBD based on whatever browsers decide to do. But that's the big concern, is the way that single sign-on works on the web looks a lot like the way ad tracking works, because it's doing the same things. It's linking up the user across many different domains for the purpose of tracking them. In this case, it's tracking them for their benefit of being signed into something, but it's kind of the same thing, that it's the same mechanism that ad trackers are doing. So.
Right. And I would imagine it'd be hard to easily quantify or separate the different types, because you could, if you're using Okta or Auth0 as a broker for other, like, say, social sites, there could be a lot of redirects.
Yeah.
Totally legitimate, but you can't just say, okay, well, if it's more than 2 redirects, then it must be an ad network, because it could be n number of redirects for an SSO flow.
Yep, exactly. So Yeah, it's pretty messy. So the idea with this document, and the reason for bringing this into the OAuth group now, is the idea that we don't want these things to break, but we also can't control what browsers are doing. So what we can do is document how OAuth and OpenID Connect use browsers today to accomplish the goals of signing people into things. Provide that information to the browsers and let them hopefully make decisions based on that don't break everything. So it's a tough game to play, but that's the idea with this document, is to collect all these use cases here so that we can make it very clear to the browser vendors what they might be breaking if they change certain behaviors.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And then sort of a future part of the story is having what would it look like if browsers actually got more involved in the login flows themselves? Because right now we're kind of building login flows on using existing browser mechanisms that exist, like cookies and redirects. Those are all things that exist and can be used for many different things. And we're using those building blocks to build login flows. But the browsers don't really know that that's happening, right? They don't really know that a login flow is being done. They just see some redirects. So what would it mean if browsers could be more involved in the process, like actually show some aspect of user interfaces in the browser rather than like in the browser UI rather than in the web part? So the same way you've got like extensions can show stuff outside of the window. They've got their own menus and can do things like that. What would it look like if browsers actually facilitated login flows? And that's sort of far future stuff that we might eventually see, and hopefully OAuth and OpenID Connect communities can influence that so that it's useful for those flows, those single sign-on flows as well. But previously, it was kind of these two issues were kind of linked together, and some of the browser vendors had said, we're not going to like break anything until we have a good solution for this to make sure you can do a login flow. But then they're actually just like, actually, we're probably going to just start breaking these redirect chains immediately. So good luck.
Wow.
Yeah.
I had an idea for a browser extension that may only be tangentially related to what we're talking about, but the idea would be the extension would get a curated list of sites where it would configure zeros and your octas, and then you'd also be able to whitelist other sites that you're choosing, because right now it's kind of buried deep within the browser configuration, and it's off by default, which is a good thing. But I wonder if as a stopgap there wouldn't be some kind of way to, just have a way to ensure that for legitimate flows you wouldn't, the browser wouldn't be busted. As far as I'm concerned, anything that involves a browser extension is probably a band-aid at best, but be our case in the short term.
Yeah, it's a good question. It totally depends on what they end up actually doing with once a website is classified as a tracker. Like, what's the actual end result of that? Is it that users have to click through and just allow it? Is it that they show a giant warning that's going to scare users away from actually logging into stuff?
Yeah.
Tough one.
I don't even actually know if you can do that from a browser extension, like allow, third-party cookies based on a site, but it was just an idea that I had given on the things that are busted right now.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't looked at the APIs enough to know, really.
Yeah. So with this conversation, so the goal is to kind of collect all these different use cases in this draft, if I understand correctly, And is there any sort of is it meant to be a guide to the industry for browser producers, or like what's the intention of it?
Yeah,
Like as a in actual use or practice?
it's it's meant to be a to inform the browser vendors about how a very large portion of their users expect browsers to work, right? It's like
Mm,
we expect to be able to do single sign-on flows. Here's how they currently work today. People expect to be able to click a button that says log in, get taken to a different website to go log in, and then come back to the application. Like that is a thing that people expect to do, and we have assumptions about the browsers will let that continue to work. Um,
right.
so yeah, yeah. There's oh, and I also just realized that there's a sort of middle or a thing happening next month. There's a step in here in between, which is the there's going to be a workshop to
Mm.
bring browser vendors in along with community members all together to actually start talking about this. And
Oh, interesting.
the link is not up. We don't have a registration link for that yet, but it'll be sometime in May. So
Mm.
that is,
That'll be up on events.oauth.net when it is
I'll make sure to
available.
post it there. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's still, there's still a question about what, like organization it'll be under. It's looking like it'll probably be in a W3C community group. Um, but,
Right.
but yeah, the idea is to actually bring the browser vendors together with the OAuth and OpenID Connect community and try to actually talk this out. Talking about what both sides of both sides need and how to make sure things don't completely break again.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
We'll learn from some past mistakes where certain things just stopped working in the name of, you know, better for the user, but unintended side effects.
Yeah. The I'm looking through the minutes of the meeting. There's actually really good notes from this one. If you go to the events.oauth.net website, you can find the link to the meeting, which then contains a link to the minutes. But yeah, very good notes this time. The some highlights. Browsers are trying. They don't want to break SSO, but they don't want the tracking to work that SSO needs. And there's this term decorated link being used a lot, which is used in the ad world as well, which basically just means links with information in them that is not relevant to the page, if that makes sense. So like you might have if your URL pattern for documents is like slash page slash one slash or slash post slash two, right? It's some sort of numeric ID that identifies the document you're loading. Then a decorated link means that that link contains other things that aren't needed to reference that particular page. So that might be query string parameters, like all the Google Analytics crap thrown in there, like UTM source, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't have to be query strings, though. It could be just path segments that are not relevant to the change based on who's looking at it, basically. So you see this with like when you go and share an Instagram photo, there's like the Instagram photo ID in the URL, but then it'll also say like it's IG SH something. So I think it's like Instagram share ID, and there'll be another ID at the end, which is like I think identifying who shared it or when it was shared. And those aren't relevant to the loading the photo. Like the photo works whether or not you include that in it. It's just for tracking purposes. And that tracking is stuff that browsers are trying to detect. So if they are looking for decorated links, they're going to look for things like, oh, this URL looks similar but keeps changing in this weird way that doesn't change the document on like the contents of the page. This must be a decorated link. We're going to now flag this as something. Or stop sharing cookies, or reset the cookies after detecting that. And it looks like
So
Safari has already done some of this, according to the minutes. I missed that on Monday. But Safari will make it look like a new browser if it detects decorated links after a certain amount of time, which breaks
So my
SSO.
my chaotic neutral brain immediately goes to, all right, if I'm an ad network, I'm gonna start making my decorated links called things like state or code, something
Right.
that
All the OAuth parameters.
you're right. I bet we see some of that happening in the future to try and
I
sneak under the radar.
Yeah, it's a battle, and yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that works. So yeah, fun times.
Hmm.
So it looks like we have a couple questions in the chat. We can talk about some of those.
Sure. We have a two-parter. One that the second part came in first, maybe.
Actually saw that it was the Google deleted the first time the question was posted. They must have thought it was spam or
Oh.
something. But
Hmm.
what part one of two? What are the security best practices for a public CLI and authorization code grant with Pixie State, OIDC nonce, and response mode query? Not sure about query.jwt. I don't know if that's supposed to be a sentence, separate sentence, or something in particular. Part two, how can I protect from client impersonation? Is the consent screen enough on the server side? So, okay, I think I get enough of the question. The a CLI client is going to be a public client, which means it doesn't have any way to authenticate itself, and impersonation is a concern for public clients. And in mobile and in single page apps, the impersonation is, I don't want to say the risk is not there, but it's a lot lower because you can somewhat rely on the redirect URL as the authentication of the app, right? It's like, you know that at least you're not going to send users off to arbitrary places back, like to arbitrary places. You're not going to be able to send arbitrary users to arbitrary places because the redirect URL has to be registered and all that good stuff. And on mobile, you can register HTTP URL patterns. You don't have to use custom URL schemes anymore, which is not. There is no registry of those, so that is the unsafe part. With command line apps, you don't get any of that, right? So that's sort of the problem. Is the impersonation risk is a lot more real on command line apps because you don't get to use redirect URLs. So if you are doing an auth code flow from a command line app and you are spinning up like a localhost web server in the command line app to catch the redirect URL will be a localhost with a random port, which is completely not identifiable in any way. So there's really no way to know if it's the real command line app or not. And anybody could use that client ID to do a flow and it would look the same. So because of that, you do want to turn on the consent screen for users so that users don't click a link and then automatically issue tokens to something they weren't expecting to. And the consent screen should be, the idea is that it's enough of a clue to tell the user what's going on and tell them, oh, are you actually trying to log into this app? And if you are, you click yes, and then the app handles the redirect and gets the tokens. And I would say yes, that's generally considered enough for solving that problem. But of course, as everything in security, it depends on what risks you are actually concerned about and what you're actually trying to protect against. But generally, yeah, it's considered enough. Yeah. Do you have anything else to add to that?
Only that, a lot of the answer was in the question itself. Like,
Mm.
definitely the best practice there. OIDC, if you're using OIDC, then you want to, generally speaking, your app should validate the state and the nonce if it is OIDC too. So that's all best practices in there too.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Oh, actually, fun thing I discovered and then had to explain yesterday during a workshop. I realized that in my workshops I build a little app by writing as little code as possible to do an OAuth flow. And basically the only code that you have to write is create a URL, right? Do the Pixie hash and stuff, create a URL, redirect the user to that URL, and then wait for the redirect back that contains the code and make a post request. So it's build a URL after calculating a random string and a hash, and then make a post request. So it's not actually a ton of code to do an OAuth flow. And then in the workshop, I go through like, okay, well, how do we, what does it mean? How do we get a refresh token? Well, we have to add this new scope to the request. And then how do we turn on OpenID Connect? How do we learn the user's email address? And every time I'm building on the same code by just adding tiny things, like add the offline access scope or add the OpenID scope to turn on OpenID Connect. And then I realized that I was able to add OpenID scope and I did not have to add a nonce parameter because I was using the authorization code flow with Pixie. Because the nonce actually is particularly a protection for the front channel. Actually, just like a random thing you have to do always, it has a specific purpose, which is when you get it through a redirect, how do you know that it's legitimate and that it's for your particular instance of the app you started? And the nonce being a number that you generated at the beginning of the flow that gets baked into the ID token lets you link up the ID token you get in the front channel with the request you started, after you check the signature of the JSON Web Token, of course. So it's specifically to protect the front channel redirect when you get the ID token. And if you get the ID token in the back channel, there's no need for it because it doesn't add any additional protection because you've already got the authorization code and Pixie protecting the front channel there.
That makes a lot of sense. I never really thought about that before.
Right. Yeah, I hadn't actually really either. But I thought that was really interesting.
Maybe reinforces the case for some of the conversations around front channel interactions and the nonce being enough protection over saying that Pixie is a must kind of thing.
Yeah, it kind of makes you wonder why OpenID Connect went and added all that stuff at the layer they added. Like, there's a lot of OpenID Connect that adds protections because of things that are missing from the core OAuth spec, right? And I don't actually remember how early OpenID Connect was compared to Pixie. Pixie is not new, but I think OpenID Connect might be a little bit older. But once you have Pixie in place, then if you're willing to do everything in the back channel, then you don't need most of what's in OpenID Connect. Like, you don't need the hybrid response modes, you don't need the nonce, you don't need any of that stuff. That's only if you are getting stuff in the front channel and pushing all your work into the front channel where you can't trust responses anymore.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting. Okay, let's see what else we got in the chat. In a single page app, how do we invalidate session after 15 minutes of inactivity? Let's see. This isn't actually necessarily an OAuth question, is it?
Not exactly. I was thinking if you're using OIDC, then you have the logout link that you can use.
But how would you do that based on just inactivity?
Well, that's actually you're right. It's a little outside the scope, no pun intended, of OAuth or OIDC. But I've seen different companies take different tacks with that. There's a there's an app that I use very regularly, a browser app, and it's very frustrating because it kicks you out after 30 minutes no matter what. And that can be a frustrating experience for a user. If you're
Mm-hmm.
active and I've been in the middle of reconciling a bank account or something, and all of a
Mm.
sudden, boom, I'm logged out.
Yep.
So, you know, I appreciate a mechanism to extend a session. At the very least, it should give you a warning like, "Hey, your session's about to end. Wrap it up."
Oh, this happens to me on the bank websites all the time because I'm doing
Yeah,
accounting and I've got the bank window open here, then QuickBooks over here, and uh, sometimes I'm just scrolling through a page of 20 transactions and it just takes a long time to read all of them, and I'm not clicking around, and the one of the banks I use does do a little pop up on the screen saying your session's about to end. Click here to extend your session. And sometimes I don't see it because I was busy typing stuff in or like figuring out how to split a
right.
transaction or whatever. And then I miss it and I look back at the screen and I'm logged out and it's super frustrating. So I don't know. I would actually like honestly push back against the idea of doing timeouts automatically based on inactivity because unless you define, unless you super have a very good definition of what inactivity means, you are probably going to end up frustrating users unless you've made a
Yeah,
very good definition of it. Because inactivity does not necessarily mean you've made an API request, or
yeah.
activity
Or
doesn't
clicked on
necessarily
something. It
mean
could be
API
you're
request.
just scrolling around. Yeah,
Right. It could be that you're scrolling around. So if you can detect mouse movement and use that as a indicator of activity, that's going to be probably a little bit better. But even then, there's a lot of use cases of things where yeah you're looking at two different things or you're flipping back and forth between two windows and you don't necessarily do anything on the page even though you're reading it, and I would argue that it's worse to frustrate users and provide a bad user experience than the marginal security benefit you get of automatically expiring those sessions after a short amount of time. So yeah. As far as like how you actually do it, one, you have to be able to detect activity. So there's two different aspects of that. One is, are you talking about activity within the web page itself, where a scroll event or a mouse move might you might want to count it as activity, or are you talking about activity as in what the APIs see, which is very different from how you're using a browser, and your APIs might see an API request to when you do a page navigation or when the page polls something. The page might be sitting there polling, which is sort of activity in one sense, but then it's also not activity because it's not necessarily user initiated. So defining what you mean by activity is the first part of that, and that's going to determine then sort of how you actually do that technically. Um, as far as how it relates to OAuth and OpenID Connect, there isn't really anything in OAuth that would help you there. But OpenID Connect has the concept of um, you have a session at the identity provider and you can do a redirect there, and if your session at the IDP ends and then the browser needs to redirect, it would then prompt the user to log in again. So again, you've got that problem of deciding how long does a session at the IDP last? What do you want to base that off of? Is it activity or time? And it can definitely get messy. But um, back relating to one of the first things we talked about, one of the tools you had available to you for this has been killed, which is the third-party cookie. Because it used to be that you could do a silent refresh of the session by embedding an iframe into the page. It's not visible, and it would hit the IDP, get redirected back with new tokens, all sort of invisibly. And that's the thing that is not working anymore because of browsers blocking third-party cookies. So,
one thing you touched on that also kind of adds complexity to it is it depends on what you mean by invalidating the session. And we get
mm,
questions all the time at Okta where somebody will be, kind of newly using our SDKs, and they'll say, I've logged out, but I still seem to be logged in. And what they were really doing was destroying the local session of their web app, say.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as Okta is concerned, they're still authenticated. So there's a quick redirect that's happening, but it happens quick enough that they may not even notice. They're redirected over to Okta. Okta says, you're authenticated, all good, and redirects you back. And that can be a jarring user experience. The user clicked on log out, but they're not really logged out. Or the local spa session expired. So, maybe they're bounced out of the spa to back to a front page or something. But as soon as they go to log in again, they're just like automatically logged in from their perspective. So that can be, that's part of an architecture for an app that you have to consider when you're using OAuth and OIDC.
And it goes both ways too, because on the flip side, if you make it so that when they click the logout button in the app, and you want it to also log out their session, you can make that happen. There are tools available to do that as the end session or logout endpoint. But the flip side is that sometimes users actually may not be expecting that. For example, if you are on YouTube and you click log out, you actually get logged out of all of your Google stuff, including Gmail, which is not YouTube, right? So does that actually match the user's expectation of what they expect to happen when they click log out or not? So before you go and decide one way or the other on that, think about what the user is expecting will happen.
Yeah, you might inadvertently implement single logout, which was not your intention. And this is especially important for, companies that are centralizing auth and maybe have a bunch of different apps, and maybe those apps are maintained by different teams either. Even it can be a jarring experience, to your point, where, you log out of one app and now all of a sudden you're bounced out of 5 others that you didn't expect to be.
Yeah, yeah. It is. Okay, let's see. A couple more questions coming in from the chats. Let's see. I'm a dev that is just beginning to use Okta at work. Any recommendations as how to get started? That's a great question. I would say we have actually quite a lot of tutorials on the Okta developer YouTube channel, this channel, that are pretty good getting started guides, because it'll walk you through building some sort of application and configuring an Okta account. There's a ton of blog posts that will also, again, do the same thing of like walking through how to sign up for an account, how to configure apps, how to, some of them go into more complicated things like configuring scopes or configuring roles or custom claims. So definitely search the developer blog. Lots of good stuff there. The Okta developer blog. But trying stuff out, I think, is, that's gonna be the best way to do it, really. And hopefully you can find a lot of resources, because we spend a lot of time creating those resources. Okay, here's another question. When using an access token for several different API resources, how should what should I consider when I configure the audience? So the audience of the access tokens is meant to identify, like which API or which resource is being used, or that token is meant for. But this is also, again, something that is entirely up to you to decide how you want to architect. And we see a whole range of this. One is to just not really use the parameter. Like if you just have one audience value across all your APIs, you're basically just not using the audience parameter. And then instead you might use scope to sort of determine which tokens can be used at which APIs. So you'll see that in a lot of systems. The other way to go is to have an audience value that is like the base URL of each API. So if you have your different APIs on different subdomains, for example, the audience could be that URL, and that's totally another way to do it. At the end of the day, it is up to you. Like your APIs will be enforcing that if they do enforce it. So it's up to you to decide if it is something you want to do or not, or if you just sort of treat your API as one whole thing. I would say that the more unrelated operations that the API is doing, the more likely it is that you actually may want to segment it. So um, I like to use Google as an example of this. Like again, YouTube and Gmail, right? Two totally different products, different names, different brands, and users would be very surprised if an access token that Gmail had was able to read data from their YouTube account, or more likely, an access token issued to an app that's going to be analyzing their email or sending out email through them. If that access token also worked at YouTube, that would be very surprising. So that's a good example of using different audiences. They don't use JSON Web Token access tokens, so nobody really knows how their access tokens actually work. But the you can see that they do have that segmenting of data, and they also use a lot of scope distinctions for that.
Yeah. The unsatisfying answer is it depends.
Yeah. A lot of the stuff in OAuth and OpenID Connect is that way. It is a lot of building blocks and tools that are available to you to use how you want to. It's not all prescriptive, which is both good and bad. It's good in that it ends up being very flexible and can be used for a lot of different things in a lot of different environments that maybe even the authors didn't anticipate. But it's sort of bad in that it's as someone brand new to the space looking for guidance, then you're often not going to find it because there are so many different ways to do it.
Yep.
I found something today that I didn't know about before, which I was surprised about, which is totally unrelated to anything we've talked about before. GitHub apparently earlier this month launched new token formats, which I feel like is something that we don't see a lot of people talking about often, and I thought it was really interesting and well thought out. I am so this is their blog post about it. It's from the beginning of April, but what they did is they used to do just like 40 character strings as their access tokens, right? Which is a normal way to do like a reference token is what we call it, where the string doesn't mean anything itself. It's just a random string. But the problem with that is it looks like you can't tell what it is by looking at it. It could be a hash, it could be an access token or whatever. And everybody ends up committing secrets and tokens and stuff to GitHub, even though they shouldn't. So if you are trying to analyze your repo to see if somebody accidentally has committed that, it's impossible to tell if it's a hash or if it's a token. So what they did is they designed new tokens, and they are prefixing every token with a string and then an underscore to help you see what kind of token it is. So personal access tokens get GHP, OAuth access tokens get GHO, refresh tokens get GHR. And that means you can actually write tools now to scan a repo looking for these tokens, because now they will all have a pattern that is unique. And you're not going to end up accidentally calculating a hash that starts with GHP underscore. That's very clearly a personal access token. So
that's really smart.
Yeah, that's really smart. And then they went even one step further, which I thought was nice. What is this checksum? So what this does is the last 6 digits of the token is actually a checksum of the rest of the token. A checksum being something that is, it's calculated based on the value, which means you can validate it based on just the value. So it's not encryption. It's not like a signature rather. It's not using any sort of shared secret or public key. It is just take the value, calculate, run some algorithm, calculate the checksum. But what it does is it means that if you are looking at one of these strings, like if you find in your code base someone has committed the string GHR underscore blah 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 blah, you can run a checksum on it to see, is it actually a real token, or did somebody write try to write documentation and put in like a placeholder value that looks close to the actual format, right? Because I like to use examples that are somewhat realistic. So, in the like the even on like the OAuth.net website where there's maybe documentation about OAuth, that website's on GitHub, and I might be using examples of tokens in that website, and I might want to write about this and say, hey, here's an example of what you can use for token formats, GHR underscore, and then put a string of characters there that looks real. But if the checksum doesn't match, GitHub knows it's not actually a real token. They don't have to actually look it up anywhere. They just know by looking at it. So their code scanner can not flag it. So reducing the false positives. So yeah,
that's cool. I was gonna say, I don't know if this influenced this move at all, but there was kind of a famous case years ago now where when OAuth providers started using JWT for tokens, a bunch of libraries and providers would allow refresh tokens to be used as access tokens, and it was a big, ugly, gnarly, well-documented problem. And because once you're checking for JWTs, the bug really was that they were validating the signature, everything looked good, and here we go, it's an access token, but it was really a refresh token, sometimes with an unlimited life on it, and that really fouled things up. So this is kind of a nice way to distinguish the different types of tokens.
Yeah, I thought that was clever. Good to see more thoughts around cool. This kind of design too, because it's, again, you're not going to find this kind of thing in the spec, because the spec, that's on the job of the spec. The spec is about interop between pieces, right, not describing how to build something. So then you have to make a decision about, well, what do you want access tokens to look like?
This is like smart opacity. It's still an opaque token, but it has some information in it to distinguish what it is, right, and validate it even.
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah, I thought that was cool. So yeah, their takeaway is they want you to go and like generate new tokens now, because you can go and like reset your personal access tokens, because they kept all the old ones active. Obviously, they're not going to just switch all tokens to this immediately. But if you go generate new tokens, they'll be in this new format. So that will then help you with the secret scanning service they have, where they can alert you if somebody does accidentally commit a token into the source code, and it'll be better at matching that now. So yeah, it's cool. And I think this is a good pattern, and the fact that also they actually call out Slack and Stripe as other people who have done this kind of thing. So I think it's a good pattern to follow, and I would like to see more companies do that if you are using opaque tokens, of course.
Right.
Yeah. What else? What else is going on? We're almost at the end of the hour. What's next? What's coming up next? So, next meeting is on Monday, and we are doing this one on Monday. TMI-BFF.
My favorite name.
I laughed pretty hard when I realized that this spec is now the top Google result for TMI-BFF, which I think is impressive. So
yes,
that's the topic for Monday. I think, actually right now there is a event, Internet Identity Workshop, which I presented at on Tuesday. I did an intro to OAuth session there, and they're also running a session about this spec at that event. This is basically a new pattern for single page apps to follow of how you want access tokens to flow between your single page app and your backend and things like that. So I haven't done a full read through of this yet. I need to do that before Monday, and but they'll be presenting it for the first time to the group on Monday. It is an individual draft right now because it has Vittorio's name in it, and that means that it has no official standing whatsoever, and it is just something that some people wrote, and then they'll be presented to the group. And I don't know if they're planning on asking the group to adopt it on Monday or not, but that would be the next step, is to ask the group to adopt it as a working group item, and then it becomes officially a working group item, and then it goes through the process of actually becoming an RFC. So we'll see how that goes. That's on Monday.
We talked a little bit about this before, but what's the TLDR for this? Like, what need does it fill?
I believe the idea is that, again, I haven't done a full read through.
Yeah.
But the idea is that if you want your front end to have the access token to be able to call your resource servers directly without using proxy. So we've talked about the proxy model before too, where you set up a backend for your front end, and the backend does the OAuth flow and holds the tokens. And then your front end can't make API requests at all. It has to go through the backend. So if you don't want that pattern, if you actually want your front end to get the access token, but you don't want to do the OAuth flow from the front end, this is how to do that. That's the idea. So do your OAuth flow from the back end, and then you pass the token to the front end, which is this BFF token request.
Right.
The front end gets the token at the end of the day, and it can go make resource server requests itself. So I don't know what
it's
exactly.
It's kind of cool to see it formalized a little, because I've seen different approaches to this pattern. When we talk about, the proxying back end, but we've definitely seen that hybrid where the front end, needs to make use of the access token, and right now it's just kind of up to your own implementation how you ferry that access token down to the front end. And depending on the framework, maybe you'll do it different in Java than you would in Node.js or something. So it'd be nice to see it formalized a little and have it be like a specific type of request. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, this one, along with some of the other drafts, are they are getting into the business of defining implementation details. That's the point of them. So like the JSON Web Token, access token draft as well, of like, this is how you can write access tokens. Actually, along those lines, it would not be unreasonable to take the pattern that Stripe, GitHub, and Slack have done of prefixing tokens and turn that into a draft of a standard. Of like, here is recommendations for bearer tokens, their reference tokens, and writing that up as a draft and submitting that as like, here's why you should do this. Here's when this is appropriate. Here's security considerations when you are doing this. And that would include the recommendations that GitHub has laid out, for example, of like, include a checksum because of this. Make sure you have X bits of entropy in your tokens. Nobody's really done that as a draft. Like bearer tokens that aren't JSON Web Tokens or reference tokens are just sort of, you're on your own to come up with how you want to do that. Like figure out how much randomness you need. How many characters do you need in order for the token to be secure enough for you, without going overboard and causing your databases to blow up or whatever.
Yeah, that was an interesting part of the GitHub blog post, just about, what's the right amount of entropy and the right, number of bytes for a checksum and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's that draft. There is also on the next Monday, first Monday in May, is the last interim meeting is OAuth 2.1. So we're back on that topic again. We ran out of time in the last meeting, so we scheduled the second one. I still have some work to do before that because I have to get a draft published by Monday so that it has a week before the meeting to be out there. So I need to finish going through the feedback and the conversations from last interim and publish a new draft based on all that.
You got a lot of stuff to go through.
I sure do. That is the rest of my day today and tomorrow, basically. And then in totally on other news, and in the other working group, which is technically not OAuth, but I'm putting it on this website anyway, there's GNAP, which is also having an interim meeting next week. And that is the alternative protocol to OAuth that is being developed in a different group, which is coming along. A lot of work, but thankfully I'm not the only one writing it. I'm actually doing a lot less of the writing of that one compared to all the other the drafts I'm working on. And that is, the idea with OAuth 2.1 is basically trying to reset a new baseline for OAuth of like clean up the mess. It got a little scattered. It got a little fragmented. There's a lot of stuff in the core draft that we don't care about anymore, so let's just clean it up. GNAP, on the other hand, is like, let's throw everything out the window and rebuild this from scratch in a better way. It's like, okay, instead of continuing to patch the house and fix the siding, we're going to just tear the whole thing down and start over and build it out of better materials. So there's, for example, a lot less reliance on the front channel in GNAP, and more stuff is sort of baked in at the beginning. It's meant to be able to support workflows in a cleaner way that you might be able to do with OAuth, but you might have to sort of bend OAuth a lot to make it work, like the device flow, for example. Technically, that's OAuth 2, but it doesn't work anything like the rest of the flows, really. And in GNAP, the equivalent of the device flow is sort of just built in, and there's nothing special about it. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to talk about that. Catch up on that during one of these happy hours as well, because after that meeting, I'm sure we'll have more to talk about there.
Yeah,
so that's what's happening.
Touched on this, but is GNAP currently like where is it in the process? Is it still like an individual spec, or is it up to being adopted by the working group yet?
It is its own working group. So it looks like I didn't link to it there, but there was a page on it here, and it is its own working group at the IETF, and it is not the OAuth working group. So it has its own group with its own charter, for example. It's got different chairs of the group, and currently there is one document in this group. So this is the one I'm looking for. Here's a list of documents for the group. There is one document in the group, whereas in OAuth there's like 100, right? So, but actually, interestingly, we are going to propose a new document to the group for specifying. Right now, the core protocol previously had like everything in it, and we're going to split out communication between the authorization server and the resource server into its own draft, because again, that communication, like in OAuth, that only matters if you are using a authorization server that is standalone. But like in OAuth, you can create a piece of software that plays the role of both the authorization server and resource server, in which case how they talk to each other you don't need a protocol. It's internal code. So that stuff's all getting taken out of the core because it won't be relevant to some deployments. So that's a new document that I believe is what one of the things we'll be talking about on the call, as bringing it up as like, let's officially adopt this new thing. We'll see. Yeah. So
cool. A lot of work coming up.
There is. Well, we are at the top of the hour, a little past the top of the hour, but I think we'll end there. Again, events.oauth.net is is where you can go to find these shows as well as upcoming OAuth meetings and other relevant events. The octadev.events is where you can find the workshops that I'm doing often on OAuth. I publish them there. So I just did a series this week that wrapped up, and that was a lot of fun. Did a lot of live coding demos yesterday. And yeah, check out the Okta Developer blog. Again, a lot of good resources there and tutorials if you are trying to get started in OAuth. So yeah, I guess we'll leave it there. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks
See you
everybody
next
for
time.
joining. See you.